his way through the city. Despite his composed demeanor, his presence exuded quiet confidence. But then, in an instant, everything changed. Two police officers, Riley and Jenkins, approached Jamal with suspicion in their eyes. Their movements were sharp, their voices edged with authority. Without hesitation, they stopped him. "Sir, we need you to come with us," Riley said, his tone leaving little room for argument. Jamal barely had time to respond before Jenkins reached for his wrist. The grip was firm, too firm. Pedestrians slowed, glancing over but saying nothing. The weight of the moment pressed down like an invisible force. "What's this about?" Jamal asked, his voice steady, refusing to be rattled. "Suspicion of criminal activity," Jenkins replied curtly. Jamal's brows furrowed. On what grounds? But reasoning had no place here. In the eyes of these officers, he was guilty until proven innocent. And so, in broad daylight, in the middle of a city that prided itself on progress, Jamal West was wrongfully arrested. Yet, what happened next would shake the entire police station to its core. Because Jamal West was no ordinary man. And when his true identity was revealed, the officers, and everyone who had a hand in this injustice, would be forced to face not just a legal case, but a reckoning of historic proportions. Stay with us as we uncover the shocking truth behind the man they never should have laid a hand on. But he knew the look, the kind that carried assumptions before a word was even spoken. He remained calm, slipping his phone back into his pocket as the officers closed the distance. His years of experience had taught him that moments like this required composure, not confrontation. "Sir, we need a word. One of them," Riley said, his voice laced with authority. Jamal met their gazes evenly. "Is there a problem, officers?" The second officer, Jenkins, took a step closer, his hand resting near his holster. "Just a routine check," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he refused to let the moment shake him. "A routine check? For what reason?" Riley exchanged a quick glance with Jenkins. It was subtle, but Jamal caught it, the silent communication of men who had already made up their minds. "Just step away from the vehicle," Riley instructed. Jamal exhaled slowly, suppressing the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He knew this was more than a routine check. It always was. He adjusted his cuffs once more, not out of nervousness, but as a silent act of defiance. Whatever was about to happen, he would handle it the way he always did, with dignity, strength, and the unwavering certainty of who he was. But soon, it wouldn't just be about him. Because in a matter of moments, these officers would discover that they had made a grave mistake. And by the time the truth came to light, the entire police station would be left reeling. Asked, keeping his voice measured. He knew better than to show frustration, but he also knew his rights. Riley's jaw tightened. "Just a routine check," he said, but there was nothing routine about the way they were watching him. Jamal glanced at Jenkins, whose fingers hovered near his holster, his stance rigid. The unspoken message was clear. Compliance wasn't a request, it was an expectation. Still, Jamal held his ground. "A routine check for what reason?" Jenkins took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "Just show us some ID," he repeated, his voice a shade firmer this time. Jamal exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. He had nothing to hide, but that had never mattered in situations like these. He reached into his pocket with deliberate, unhurried movements and pulled out his wallet. "Here you go," he said, handing over his license. Riley took it, studying the name, the photo, the details. A flicker of something, hesitation, uncertainty, crossed his face, but it was gone just as fast. He handed the ID to Jenkins, who did the same, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. "Wait here," Riley said, stepping away as he reached for his radio. Jamal remained still, his heartbeat steady but alert. Something about their reaction wasn't adding up. He had been stopped before, but this felt different. And he was right, because in a matter of moments, the weight of their mistake would crash down on them with the force of a reckoning they never saw coming. Lips pressed into a thin line as he exchanged a quick glance with Jenkins. The tension between them was palpable, but Jamal refused to let it rattle him. Riley flipped the ID between his fingers, then looked back at Jamal. "You come around here often?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge beneath it. Jamal exhaled slowly, keeping his posture relaxed. "I live and work in this city." Is there a reason you're asking me these questions? Jenkins shifted again, his fingers still hovering near his holster. The movement wasn't lost on Jamal. He had seen it before. The subtle readiness, the quiet anticipation of control. Riley took a step closer. We're just doing our job, sir. Jamal didn't flinch. And what exactly is your job right now? Because last I checked, having breakfast and walking to my car isn't a crime. For a brief second, Riley's smirk faltered. He glanced down at the ID again, his jaw tightening. Something wasn't adding up for him, and Jamal could see it. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. Then, finally, Riley exhaled sharply and turned to Jenkins. Run it. Jenkins took the ID and stepped away, reaching for his radio. Jamal remained still, his pulse steady, his expression unreadable. He had nothing to hide, but he had a feeling that when his name came back over that radio, everything was about to change. Anything we should know about. His tone was laced with skepticism, as if the very idea of Jamal being a lawyer was improbable. Jamal met Jenkins' gaze without flinching. I'm sure, he said firmly. Unless carrying a briefcase and going to work is now considered suspicious. Riley let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Just doing our due diligence, sir. Jamal exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm. He had dealt with this kind of treatment before. The veiled accusations, the unspoken challenge, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. I understand, officer, he said, keeping his tone measured. But if we're done here, I'd like to get to my meeting. Riley studied him for a moment, then exchanged another glance with Jenkins. Whatever they were looking for, they weren't finding it. Finally, Riley handed back the ID. Go ahead, he said, the smirk still lingering. Have a good day, counselor. Jamal took his license, sliding it back into his wallet. He gave a small nod and turned toward his car, his movements deliberate and unhurried. But just as he reached for the door handle, Jenkins' radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end spoke quickly, and as the words registered, everything changed. Riley stiffened. Jenkins' expression shifted from smug to something closer to disbelief. Jamal noticed it immediately. Whatever they had just learned, it had shaken them. And in the next few seconds, the entire power dynamic of this encounter was about to flip on its head. Behind his back, the sudden force sending a sharp jolt of pain through his shoulder. Hey, Jamal protested, instinctively tensing. What are you doing? Jenkins was already stepping in, reaching for his cuffs. Just making sure you're not a threat, he muttered, his grip tightening. Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears. He had done everything right, stayed calm, complied, kept his hands visible, but none of it mattered. He knew how these moments played out, how quickly they could turn deadly. Officer, I haven't done anything wrong, he said evenly, refusing to let his voice waver. This is unlawful. Riley scoffed. Yeah? You can tell it to the judge. But just as Jenkins reached for his radio to call it in, a voice crackled over the frequency. The words were quick, urgent, and suddenly, everything changed. Jenkins froze mid-motion. Riley's grip loosened ever so slightly. Jamal could feel it, the shift. Whatever had just come through that radio had shaken them. Riley exchanged a tense glance with Jenkins, his smirk gone. Then, finally, he released Jamal's arm. Jamal rolled his shoulder, his eyes locked onto them. What? He asked, his voice steady. What did you just find out? The silence that followed was thick, charged with something unspoken. Then, finally, Riley took a step back, his expression unreadable. And Jamal knew, whatever had just happened, it had turned this entire situation on its head. Sharp with outrage. That man hasn't done anything wrong. Other bystanders began to gather, murmuring among themselves. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The weight of their stares didn't seem to faze Riley or Jenkins, at least, not yet. Jamal gritted his teeth against the pain, his breath coming in slow, measured inhales. He had done everything right, followed every unwritten rule, and still, here he was, face down on the pavement, cuffs biting into his wrists. This is a mistake, he said, his voice tight but controlled. You know that. Riley let out a low chuckle. The only mistake was thinking you could talk your way out of this. But just as Jenkins reached for his radio to call it in, the device crackled with urgency. The voice on the other end was sharp, commanding, different from the usual dispatch tone. Jenkins hesitated, his hand hovering over his radio. Riley's smirk faltered as he glanced toward his partner, suddenly uneasy. Jamal noticed the shift immediately. Whatever had just come through that radio, it had changed everything. Jamal exhaled slowly, steadying himself as the car rocked slightly from the force of the door slamming shut. The hard plastic seat was cold against his back, and the weight of the cuffs dug into his wrists. He shifted slightly, testing their tightness, but there was no relief. Outside, the voices of the growing crowd grew louder. "Let him go," someone shouted. "He didn't do anything," another added. Jamal turned his head slightly, catching glimpses of concerned faces through the squad car window. The young man with the phone was still recording, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. Riley and Jenkins, however, remained unmoved. Riley leaned against the car, arms crossed, while Jenkins spoke low into his radio. Their confidence was unwavering, as if they had already decided how this story would end. But then, Jenkins' radio crackled again. The voice on the other end was urgent, almost frantic. Riley frowned, glancing at his partner. Jenkins stiffened, his grip tightening on the radio. Jamal watched them carefully. Something had changed. He could see it in the way their postures tensed, in the way Riley's smirk faded ever so slightly. And in that moment, Jamal knew, whatever information had just come through, it had shattered their certainty. Back. His posture remained straight, his expression unreadable, but inside, his thoughts were razor-sharp. Every step he took echoed against the sterile floors, drawing glances from officers and staff alike. Some barely spared him a second look, treating him as just another case passing through the system. But others, those who recognized his name, his face, froze mid-step, their conversation stalling. Whispers began to ripple through the station. Eyes darted between Jamal and the officers escorting him. Riley and Jenkins seemed oblivious at first, their grip on his arms firm, their confidence still intact. But as the murmurs grew, as heads turned and backs stiffened, even they couldn't ignore it. Something was shifting. Jenkins cleared his throat, his fingers twitching near his radio. Riley's jaw tightened, but his grip on Jamal's arm instinctively loosened, just slightly, but enough for Jamal to notice. Then, from across the room, a voice rang out, sharp, commanding, unmistakable. "Stop right there." Everything in the station seemed to freeze. Jamal didn't need to see who had spoken. He already knew. And in that moment, the weight of everything that had just happened, the wrongful arrest, the public outrage, the reckless abuse of power, came crashing down on Riley and Jenkins like a tidal wave, racing through possible next steps. He had to stay composed, had to think strategically. Every moment that passed, every glance exchanged between officers, told him something was off. The tired-looking officer continued processing his information, his expression shifting subtly as he read the screen. A crease formed between his brows. He hesitated, then glanced up at Riley and Jenkins. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Riley's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "What's the problem? Just process him." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned the screen slightly, angling it so only he and the two officers could see. Jenkins stepped closer, his face tightening as his eyes scanned whatever was on the monitor. Jamal couldn't see what they were looking at, but he saw their reaction. The shift in their posture, the way Riley's jaw clenched, the flicker of uncertainty in Jenkins' eyes. Something wasn't right. The tired officer exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Then, finally, he spoke the words that would change everything. "You really messed up." Thought they had won. Jamal leaned back against the cold concrete wall, exhaling slowly. His mind wasn't on the cell, the smell, or even the officer's taunts. It was on the moment back at the booking desk. The shift in their demeanor. The tension in the air. The words "you really messed up." Something had changed. He replayed every detail in his head, trying to piece it together. The officer's hesitation. The flicker of doubt in Jenkins' eyes. The way Riley's usual arrogance had cracked, just for a second. Whatever had shown up on that screen, it had rattled them. Jamal knew the law. He knew his rights. And he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the one who should be worried right now. Because whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be in their favor. Job. But right now, he wasn't thinking about proving himself. He was thinking about what he had just witnessed. "Sir," Stevens said, his voice cautious as he addressed Riley. "Are you sure about that arrest?" Riley frowned, irritation flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Stevens hesitated, glancing toward the holding cells before lowering his voice. I looked up Jamal West. Jenkins let out a scoff. And Stevens swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the clipboard he was holding. I think you should check again. Because if this is the same Jamal West I found in the system, we have a serious problem. Riley's jaw tightened. The uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at him since the arrest suddenly sharpened into something heavier. Jenkins rolled his eyes. What kind of problem? Stevens exhaled, then met Riley's gaze head-on. The kind that means we just arrested the wrong man, he said. And not just any man. Had just thrown cuffs on someone with that kind of power. Riley clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. That doesn't change anything, he muttered, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. Stevens didn't look convinced. It changes everything, he said firmly. If we made a bad arrest, especially this bad, it's not just a slap on the wrist. This could turn into a lawsuit. Headlines. Internal investigations. You really want to be at the center of that. Jenkins, who had been listening quietly, let out a nervous scoff. Come on, the guy was acting suspicious. We had reason. Did we? Stevens cut in. Or did we just assume? Silence. For the first time, Riley felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He had made plenty of arrests, some questionable, some outright messy. But this was different. If Stevens was right, if they had just wrongfully arrested one of the most well-known civil rights attorneys in the country, then this wasn't just a mistake. It was a disaster waiting to explode. Holding areas swung open, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the concrete walls. Jamal didn't move. He remained seated on the narrow bench, his back straight, his expression unreadable. Then, Riley appeared. But this time, the confidence, the arrogance, was gone. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight. Something had shifted. Jamal met his gaze, calm and steady. Officer, he said evenly. Riley didn't respond right away. He just stood there, gripping the keys in his hand a little too tightly. Finally, he exhaled sharply and unlocked the cell. Come with me, Riley said, his voice clipped. Jamal didn't move at first. Am I free to go? Riley hesitated. Just come with me. Jamal studied him for a moment, then rose to his feet, adjusting his suit jacket as if this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But inside, he knew, this was the moment things would change. For him, for them, for everyone watching. Asked, her tone firm. Riley hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Suspicious activity, he said finally. He matched a description. Thompson's jaw tightened. What description? Jenkins cleared his throat. Reports of a suspect in the area. We were following up. Thompson folded her arms. And this suspect, did he actually commit a crime? Or was he just existing in the wrong place at the wrong time? Neither officer answered. The tension in the air thickened. Around them, other officers pretended not to listen, but Thompson knew better. She took a slow, measured breath. Do you have any idea who Jamal West is? Riley shifted uncomfortably. He's a civil rights attorney. She cut in, her voice low but sharp. A high-profile one. Which means in about 5 minutes, his lawyer, probably one of the best in the country, is going to walk through that door. And after that, reporters, internal affairs, maybe even the mayor's office. Jenkins paled. Riley clenched his jaw. Thompson leaned in slightly, her voice like steel. So, before I make my next call, you'd better tell me the truth. Did you just arrest the wrong man? Tone, unreadable. His eyes lifted slowly to meet hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Thompson finally broke the silence. Jamal Carter, she said evenly. Do you know why you're here? Jamal exhaled through his nose, his expression giving nothing away. I was hoping you could tell me, he replied, his voice measured. Thompson glanced at Riley, then back at Jamal. Something wasn't adding up. She had seen enough questionable arrests to know when a case wasn't as open and shut as it seemed. Turning to Riley, her tone remained firm. I want to see the report. Every detail. Riley swallowed but nodded. Yes, ma'am. As he stepped away, Thompson kept her eyes on Jamal, her instincts telling her that this was only the beginning. Was given no clear answer. When I asked again, Officer Riley told me to put my hands on the car. I did exactly as he said. Then, without warning, they cuffed me and brought me here. Thompson studied him carefully. His voice was level, his posture still relaxed, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his words. She glanced at Riley, who shifted slightly but said nothing. "You're saying you never resisted?" she asked, her tone neutral but firm. "Not once," Jamal replied without hesitation. Thompson let a bead of silence stretch between them before turning back to Riley. "I assume there's body cam footage?" Riley cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. It's being processed." "Good," Thompson said, her expression unreadable. "Because I intend to watch every second of it." Jamal gave a small nod, as if he had expected nothing less. Meanwhile, Riley avoided her gaze. Thompson had been in this job long enough to know when there was more to a story than what was being told. And something told her she hadn't heard the whole truth yet. Heads turned as Officer Jenkins stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Riley, then at Thompson, before clearing his throat. "Lieutenant," Jenkins said, his voice careful. "I heard you were speaking with Mr. West." Thompson folded her arms. "That's right. We were just discussing the circumstances of his arrest." She let her gaze linger on Riley for a moment before shifting it back to Jenkins. "Maybe you can clarify something for me. Did Mr. West resist?" Jenkins hesitated, his eyes flickering to Riley before settling back on Thompson. "He questioned us," he admitted. "But he didn't fight or run. Just asked why he was being detained." Thompson's jaw tightened. She had suspected as much. Slowly, she turned back to Riley, her expression unreadable. "A gut feeling isn't probable cause, Officer Riley. I shouldn't have to remind you of that." Riley swallowed hard, but said nothing. Thompson exhaled through her nose before looking at Jamal. "Mr. West, I'm going to review the body cam footage. If your story checks out, we'll address this properly." Jamal gave a slow nod. "That's all I ask, Lieutenant." Thompson turned back to her officers. "Until then, I want him treated with the respect every citizen is owed." "Understood." Both men murmured their agreement, but Thompson wasn't entirely convinced. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. An internal review on our hands. Thompson's grip tightened around the phone as she scanned the screen, her expression unreadable. She had been in tough situations before, but this was a different kind of storm brewing. Slowly, she looked up at Stevens. "Does the captain know?" Stevens shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to bring it to you first." Thompson exhaled sharply, her mind already racing through the possible fallout. She turned slightly, glancing back toward the holding cell where Jamal sat, still composed, still waiting. "All right," she said, her voice low but firm. "Give me that body cam footage. Now." Stevens nodded and hurried off. Thompson squared her shoulders, steeling herself. Whatever had happened tonight, one thing was clear. This wasn't just another arrest. And if they didn't handle it right, it was going to cost them all. Some random guy off the street. He's a high-profile civil rights attorney. The kind who doesn't just fight cases. He makes them national news. Riley and Jenkins stiffened. Riley swallowed hard. "Ma'am, we didn't know." "That's the problem." Thompson cut in, her voice sharp. "You didn't know? And now we're in the middle of something that could blow up in our faces." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "What do we do, Lieutenant?" Thompson exhaled, trying to rein in her frustration. "First, we get that body cam footage. I want it in my hands immediately." Her gaze locked onto Riley. "And you better hope it backs up your story." Riley nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." Thompson turned away for a moment, pressing her fingers to her temple. Damage control. That's what this was now. And if the footage showed anything less than a justified arrest, they were going to have a whole new problem on their hands. Something soon. This is going to spiral out of control. Thompson clenched her jaw, her mind racing. This was exactly what she had feared. Word had spread, and now the station was on the verge of becoming ground zero for a public outcry. She turned back to Riley and Jenkins, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Give me that footage. Now, if there's even a hint that this arrest was unlawful, we need to act before this situation explodes." Riley gave a stiff nod and hurried off, Jenkins right behind him. Stevens shifted anxiously. "Lieutenant, we need a strategy. If the media gets their hands on this before we do." "I know." Thompson cut in, already moving toward the entrance. "Get the captain on the phone. I want him briefed before he hears about this on the news." As she reached the front of the station, the chants outside grew louder. Through the glass doors, she could see the crowd, bigger than before, more organized. People held signs, their faces tense with determination. Thompson took a steadying breath. This wasn't just about one arrest anymore. This was about trust, reputation, and the kind of mistake that could cost them everything. Station, the tension was palpable. Every decision she made now would have lasting consequences. Thompson exhaled sharply, rolling her shoulders back as she steadied herself. There was no room for hesitation. She turned to Stevens. "We need a statement drafted, something firm but measured. Acknowledge the arrest, emphasize that it's under review, and make it clear that we take accountability seriously. No spin, just facts." Stevens nodded, already pulling out his phone to start drafting. Thompson's gaze flicked toward the holding area. "And give me that footage. If there's anything on it that complicates our position, I need to know now, not when a reporter asks me about it." As her officers moved with renewed urgency, Thompson remained rooted to the spot, the weight of command settling squarely on her shoulders. She hadn't asked for a crisis this early into her tenure, but it had found her anyway. Now, it was up to her to make sure they got through it intact. Walking a tightrope, one wrong move, and this situation could explode beyond their control. Thompson took a steady breath, then turned to Stevens. "Get a patrol officer out there to address the crowd. We need to show them that we're not ignoring their concerns, but make it clear that we're handling this properly." Stevens nodded and hurried off. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Jamal remained still, listening. He had been in enough legal battles to know that public pressure could be a powerful force, but only if the truth came out before it could be buried. Back at the front, Thompson squared her shoulders. The reporters were already setting up for live broadcasts. The longer they waited, the worse this would get. She turned sharply. "Where's that body cam footage?" A uniformed officer rushed over. "Ma'am, it's uploading now. Should have it in a few minutes." "Not fast enough." Thompson clenched her jaw. Outside, the chants of "justice for Jamal" grew louder. Time was running out. The trust, or lack thereof, between the police and the community. Stevens exhaled, nodding. "All right, I'll start drafting the statement." Thompson turned toward the holding area, her steps brisk and deliberate. As much as she wanted to believe this would smooth things over, she knew better. People wouldn't forget this easily, especially not Jamal West. When she reached the cell, Jamal stood, already sensing what was coming. He met her gaze, calm but expectant. "Mr. West," Thompson said, keeping her tone professional, "we've reviewed the situation, and there's no legal basis to hold you. You're free to go." Jamal studied her for a moment before responding. "That's simple, huh?" Thompson didn't flinch. "It's the right call." Jamal gave a slow nod, then stepped forward as she unlocked the door. "We'll see if your department learns from it." As he walked past her, Thompson felt the weight of his words settle over her. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about everything that came after. Her tone was firm, but there was no avoiding the weight of the moment. She knew an apology wouldn't be enough, not for Jamal, not for the people outside demanding justice. Jamal exhaled, studying her. "I've seen how these misunderstandings go, Lieutenant. They ruin lives." Thompson didn't look away. "I know, and I also know that words won't fix this. But I can promise you, this will be addressed." For a moment, the two stood in silence. Then, with a slow nod, Jamal stepped forward. Thompson moved aside, allowing him to walk past her and out of the cell. As they made their way toward the front of the station, the muffled chants outside grew louder. The real test was just beginning. Disappear into the background. And neither would the people outside. Thompson remained in the doorway for a moment, watching as Jamal exchanged quiet words with his family, his posture steady despite everything that had happened. The energy in the crowd was electric. Relief, anger, determination, all simmering beneath the surface. Stevens stepped up beside her. "The media is going to have a field day with this." Thompson sighed. "I know. She had done what she could tonight, but it wasn't enough. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest. It was about a system, a history, and the trust they had shattered yet again." As Jamal turned and met her gaze one last time before disappearing into the crowd, Thompson knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. As if he had expected this to happen. That unsettled her. Thompson exhaled, setting the reports down. The facts were there. Riley and Jenkins had acted on instinct, not evidence. And now, the department would have to answer for it. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Stevens stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Captain wants to see you." "Of course he does." Thompson pushed back her chair and stood. "Any word on how the department is handling the fallout?" Stevens hesitated. "They're bracing for it. There's already talk of an internal investigation, maybe even a press conference. Thompson nodded, unsurprised. Good. We need to own this before someone else controls the story. As she made her way to the captain's office, her mind kept circling back to Jamal West. He wasn't just a man who had been wrongfully arrested. He was a man who knew exactly what to do with that injustice. And that meant the battle was only beginning. She began searching for everything she could find on Jamal West. His name pulled up dozens of articles, high-profile cases, interviews, legal victories. He wasn't just any civil rights attorney. He was a force to be reckoned with. He had taken on police misconduct cases before, and more than once, he had won. Thompson's jaw tightened. No wonder this blew up so fast. This wasn't just about an unjust arrest. This was about a man who knew exactly how to fight back. A knock at the door made her pause. Stevens again. Lieutenant, you're going to want to see this. She motioned him in, already bracing herself. Stevens stepped forward and placed his phone on her desk. A news article was pulled up, the headline glaring. Prominent civil rights attorney wrongfully arrested, calls for investigation grow. Thompson exhaled sharply. The ripple effects had already begun. Across the country, including one not far from their own. Thompson's pulse quickened as she leaned back in her chair. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. This was bigger, much bigger. If Jamal had been targeted before, was it possible that his arrest tonight wasn't just an unfortunate mistake? A chill ran down her spine. If someone in her department had known exactly who he was before bringing him in, then this was no longer just a PR crisis. It was something far more dangerous. She glanced at Stevens, who was still standing by her desk. We need to find out if Riley and Jenkins knew who Jamal was before they arrested him. Stevens' brow furrowed. You think this was intentional? Thompson exhaled slowly. I don't know, but I'm about to find out. She had learned, cross-referencing reports, revisiting the arrest footage, and making notes on every inconsistency. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just misconduct. This was a deliberate attempt to silence a man who was dangerously close to exposing something bigger. Thompson ran a hand through her hair, exhaling sharply. If this was true, then someone high up had orchestrated it. Riley and Jenkins might have been pawns, but who was pulling the strings? She stood abruptly, grabbing her notepad. It was time to confront Riley and Jenkins. As she stepped out of her office, Stevens fell into step beside her. What's the plan? Thompson's jaw tightened. We get answers. Now. Thompson turned to face them, her expression unreadable. She didn't waste time. Did you know who Jamal West was before you arrested him? Riley stiffened. Ma'am, answer the question. Her tone was sharp, leaving no room for evasion. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. No, Lieutenant. We didn't know. Thompson studied them carefully. If they were lying, they were doing a damn good job of hiding it. But if they were telling the truth, that meant someone else had set this in motion. She took a step closer. Then explain to me why you arrested a man who complied with your orders. And don't say gut feeling. I'm done hearing that excuse. Riley swallowed hard. Look, we were just following standard procedure. He questioned us. We thought he was acting suspiciously. Suspicious how? Thompson cut in. Because he asked why he was being detained? Silence. Jenkins exhaled. We screwed up. Thompson nodded slowly. Yeah, you did. And now we all have to answer for it. The silence in the room was suffocating. Thompson let it hang there, forcing them to sit with the weight of what they had done. You arrested a federal asset, she continued, her voice controlled but laced with fury. You didn't just make a bad call. You jeopardized an active investigation. Do you have any idea how serious that is? Jenkins swallowed hard. Lieutenant, save it. Thompson cut him off. Right now, the only thing I care about is how we fix this before it blows up in all our faces. Riley rubbed a hand over his face, visibly shaken. What do we do? Thompson exhaled sharply, crossing her arms. For starters, you're going to finish that report, and you're going to tell the truth. No cover-ups, no spin. Then, you're going to pray that Jamal West doesn't decide to bury this entire department. Jenkins nodded weakly, and Riley gave a small, defeated nod. Thompson studied them both for a long moment. You screwed up, she said finally. Now let's see if we can clean up your mess before it takes us all down. Chief, we have a serious problem, Thompson said, keeping her voice firm despite the tension crackling in the air. Daniel's glare swept over Riley and Jenkins before locking onto her. Oh, I'm well aware, Lieutenant. Care to explain why the hell there's a mob outside my station and reporters sniffing around for a scandal? Thompson didn't flinch. Because these two officers, she gestured sharply toward Riley and Jenkins, arrested a man without cause. And not just any man, Jamal West. Civil rights attorney. Federal asset. Undercover in an active investigation. Daniel's expression flickered, but he recovered fast. You're telling me, he said slowly, his voice dangerously low, that my officers just walked straight into a federal sting? Yes, sir. The room went dead silent. Jenkins shifted uneasily, and Riley looked like he wanted to disappear. Daniels exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. Jesus Christ. He lowered his hand and leveled a hard stare at Thompson. How bad is it? Thompson crossed her arms. Bad. If this gets out, we're looking at lawsuits, federal oversight, maybe even criminal charges. The department's reputation is already on the line. One wrong move, and it'll take us all down. Daniels nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing. All right, damage control. What do we do? Thompson didn't hesitate. First, we cooperate fully with the feds. Second, we get ahead of the story before the media spins it out of our control. Third, she turned her sharp gaze back to Riley and Jenkins. We hold people accountable. Daniels studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. Then let's get to work. Chief Daniels let out a sharp breath, his frustration evident. Fantastic. Just what we needed. He ran a hand over his face before leveling a hard stare at Thompson. How deep does this go? Thompson kept her posture rigid. Deep. The feds have been watching multiple departments, including ours. Jamal West was gathering evidence. If we don't act fast, this could turn into a full-blown scandal. Daniels clenched his jaw, his gaze flicking back to Riley and Jenkins. We'll deal with them later, he repeated, his voice like steel. Right now, we need to focus on damage control. Thompson gave a sharp nod, keeping her voice measured. I've already started gathering intel. The federal investigation into systemic racism has led to oversight in other cities. And if we're not careful, we'll be next. Daniels exhaled slowly, then straightened. All right, we need a plan. Fast. Williams greeted them with a curt nod, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Daniels. We need to talk. Now. Daniels squared his shoulders. All right, Agent Williams. What's this about? Williams shut the door behind him, his movements deliberate. I think you already know. Jamal West. He let the name hang in the air for a moment. We've been monitoring his work for months. His arrest tonight? That was a critical mistake. Thompson resisted the urge to glance at Riley and Jenkins, who were visibly tense. We're aware of the situation, she said carefully. And we're handling it. Williams' expression didn't waver. Not anymore, you're not. He pulled a file from inside his jacket and tossed it onto the table. This department is now officially under federal review. And if I find any indication of misconduct beyond what happened tonight, trust me when I say, there will be consequences. Anticipate Williams' next move. What exactly do you need from us, Agent? She asked, keeping her voice steady. Williams leveled her with a hard stare. First, I need every detail of tonight's arrest. Every report, every piece of body cam footage, every statement. I want full transparency, no omissions. Daniels exhaled sharply. You'll have it. Williams nodded. Second, Jamal West is no longer your problem. The Bureau will be handling his protection and any further interactions. You will not contact him, you will not interfere, and you will not attempt to control the narrative. Thompson clenched her jaw. Understood. Williams let the silence stretch for a moment before delivering his final blow. And lastly, there will be an internal review of this department. Any misconduct we uncover will have consequences. His gaze flickered to Riley and Jenkins, who both looked pale. Serious consequences. The room was thick with tension, but Thompson knew there was no room for argument. We'll comply, she said firmly, though the words left a bitter taste in her mouth. Williams studied her for a beat, then nodded. Good. Because trust me, you don't want to know what happens if you don't. Grasp the full extent of what was happening. This wasn't just about Jamal West anymore. This was about the entire department, the entire city, and if they didn't tread carefully, it could all come crashing down. Williams' gaze hardened as he addressed the room. You will provide him with a formal apology on behalf of the department. Any resistance to these orders will be met with swift and decisive action. Daniel's face flushed with anger, but he nodded stiffly. Understood. Williams turned to Thompson, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant, I expect you to oversee this personally. Make sure there are no further incidents. Thompson nodded, her mouth dry. I'll take care of it. With that, Williams gave a curt nod and turned to leave. But before exiting the room, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. And one more thing, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Consider this your warning. The federal government is watching closely. Any further misconduct within this department will not be tolerated. As the door closed behind him, the room was left in silence. Break the storm that was already raging. Thompson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, suffocating in its intensity. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but she had no choice but to navigate it. The atmosphere at the police station was heavy with tension as the day wore on. The morning's events had set off a chain reaction that no one could have anticipated, and now, everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The news of Jamal West's wrongful arrest had spread like wildfire, igniting outrage not just within the community, but across the entire city. Protests had erupted outside the station. Activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens all demanding justice. Inside, Chief Frank Daniels was desperately trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. He knew the department was teetering on the edge of a public relations disaster. The only way to stop it from spiraling out of control was to make a public apology. But he also knew that a simple apology might not be enough. It was the cost of maintaining order. But now, that justification felt hollow. Chief Daniels sat at his desk, staring at the phone, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the receiver and dialed the number for the public relations team. He needed to prepare a statement, something that would show the community the department was taking this seriously. But deep down, he knew that no amount of carefully crafted words could undo the damage that had been done. When the PR team answered, Daniels spoke in a low, measured tone. I need you to draft a public apology. We're going to address the media outside the station this afternoon. Understood, Chief. We'll prepare something immediately, the voice on the other end replied. Daniels hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him, the consequences of years spent looking the other way when officers like Riley and Jenkins crossed the line. He had always told himself it was just part of the job, that. Slowly, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. Sometimes, you had to make compromises to keep the peace. But now, those compromises were coming back to haunt him. A knock on the door pulled Daniels from his thoughts. Lieutenant Kate Thompson stood in the doorway, her expression tense but determined. Chief, Jamal West is waiting outside with the crowd. Daniels nodded, forcing himself to stand. Good. I'm going out there to make the apology. Thompson hesitated, then stepped forward. Chief, I need to tell you something before you go out there. Daniels raised an eyebrow. What is it, Thompson? She took a deep breath. I've uncovered evidence of systemic corruption within the department, bribery, cover-ups, racial profiling. This goes beyond just Riley and Jenkins. It's been happening for years, and it's been swept under the rug. Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. Are you sure? Thompson nodded. I've already started gathering the evidence. With Jamal's help and the federal oversight team, we can start cleaning up this mess. But it's going to be a long and difficult process. Daniels exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. Press conference. Slowly, his shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. Then, he straightened, resolve settling in. Then we do what we have to do. It's time to face the consequences of our actions. Thompson gave a small nod of approval. I'll back you up out there, Chief. We need to show the community that we're serious about change. Daniels didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said everything. He knew this wasn't just about saving face anymore. This was about survival. If they didn't act now, the entire department could be dismantled. Together, they walked out of the office and headed toward the front of the station. As they approached the doors, the sound of the crowd outside grew louder. Angry voices demanding justice, chanting for accountability. Daniels felt his stomach knot with anxiety, but he kept his expression neutral as he pushed open the doors and stepped into the sunlight. The crowd fell silent at the sight of him. Cameras clicked, microphones were thrust forward, and reporters called out questions. But Daniels ignored them, his focus locked on the podium that had been set up for the press conference. Will be held to the highest standards of accountability, and systemic changes will be implemented to ensure that what happened today never happens again. At the podium, Daniels could see Jamal standing among the crowd, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding attention. Daniels cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone, adjusting it slightly. He could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze, judging him, waiting to see what he would say. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I want to start by acknowledging the events that took place earlier today. The arrest of Mr. Jamal West was a mistake, one that should never have happened. I take full responsibility for what occurred, and I want to offer my sincerest apologies to Mr. West and to the community." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of skepticism and anger thick in the air. Daniels could feel the pressure building, the weight of decades of mistrust bearing down on him. "We recognize that this incident is part of a larger problem," Daniels continued, his tone somber. "A problem that has persisted for far too long within our department. I want to assure you all that we are committed to addressing these issues head-on. Effective immediately, officers. Conversation can't end here. Riley and Jenkins have been suspended pending an internal investigation. We will be conducting a thorough review of our practices and procedures, and we will work closely with federal oversight to ensure that we are holding ourselves to the highest standards of accountability." The crowd was quiet now, listening intently, but Daniels could still see the doubt in their eyes, the weariness that came from years of broken promises. "I know that words alone are not enough," Daniels said, his voice faltering slightly. "We have a lot of work to do to rebuild the trust that has been lost. But I want you to know that we are committed to making the necessary changes. We will work with community leaders, activists, and organizations to create a department that serves and protects everyone, regardless of race or background." He paused, searching for the right words to end his statement. But before he could continue, Jamal West stepped forward, raising a hand to stop him. "Chief Daniels," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm, "I appreciate the apology, but this. Protect and serve. This isn't just about words. This is about action. True justice goes beyond a public apology. It requires real change, real accountability, and real commitment." Daniels nodded slowly, stepping back from the microphone. He knew Jamal was right. An apology was just the beginning. The real work was still ahead of them. Jamal turned to face the crowd, his presence commanding their full attention. "We've heard apologies before," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But what we need now is a commitment to real, lasting change. We need to hold those in power accountable for their actions, and we need to work together to create a system that treats everyone with fairness and dignity." The crowd erupted in applause, voices rising in agreement. Jamal's words resonated with them, cutting through the anger and frustration that had been building for so long. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Jamal continued, his voice strong and clear. "This is about all of us. It's about every person who has been wronged by a system that's supposed to. People were hurt. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. And it's about ensuring that justice is not just a word, but a reality." The crowd cheered, and Jamal paused, letting the energy of the moment wash over him. He could see the hope in their eyes, the desire for something better. It was a powerful feeling, one that he knew he couldn't ignore. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Jamal said, his tone more measured now. "It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes all of us working together. But I believe that we can make it happen. I believe that we can build a better future, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will come after us." As the applause swelled, Jamal stepped back from the podium, his message delivered. The crowd's response was overwhelming, a surge of support that filled him with determination. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but he was ready for it. He was ready to lead the fight for justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that the voices of his tone calm but firm. As Jamal made his way through the crowd, embracing friends and supporters, Lieutenant Thompson watched from the steps of the station. She felt a mixture of relief and resolve, relief that the immediate crisis had been averted, and resolve to see the changes through. She knew the department had a long road ahead, but with people like Jamal West leading the charge, she believed they could make it. Thompson turned to Chief Daniels, who was still standing by the podium, his expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "We have a lot of work to do," she said quietly. Daniels nodded, his eyes fixed on the crowd. "Yes, we do, but we'll get through this." As the crowd began to disperse, Thompson noticed a figure lingering at the edge of the gathering. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit, carrying an air of quiet authority. He watched Jamal with an intense gaze, his expression unreadable. Curious, Thompson made her way over to him. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man turned to her, his eyes sharp and focused. "I'm here to speak with Mr. West," he said. Across from a group of local activists and community leaders, his expression serious yet determined. The man's voice was low and controlled. "I have a message for him." Thompson frowned, studying him more closely. There was something about him that put her on edge, something she couldn't quite place. "Who are you?" she asked. The man smiled slightly, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. "Just someone who has a vested interest in seeing justice done." Before Thompson could respond, the man turned and walked toward Jamal, disappearing into the crowd. She watched him go, a sense of unease settling in her gut. Whoever he was, she had a feeling this wasn't the last time they would see him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the station steps, Thompson knew the events of the day were just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could finally start to make things right. Across the city, in a small community center, another important meeting was taking place. Jamal sat across from a group of local activists and community leaders, his expression serious yet determined. Police department, ensuring accountability and transparency. And they would launch educational programs to inform citizens of their rights and empower them to advocate for themselves. At a table surrounded by a diverse group of individuals, community leaders, activists, legal experts, and concerned citizens, Jamal and his team hammered out the details of the Community Justice Initiative, debating strategies and priorities. "We need to focus on education," argued Maria Hernandez, a local school teacher. "If we want lasting change, we have to start with the youth." "I agree," said Dr. James Carter, a sociology professor at the City University. "But we can't ignore the immediate needs of those currently suffering under an unjust system. We need a multi-pronged approach." Jamal listened carefully to each perspective, taking notes and asking questions. He was impressed by the passion and expertise in the room. This was exactly what he had hoped for, a collaborative effort that drew on the strengths of the entire community. As the meeting progressed, they began to form concrete plans. They would establish a legal aid clinic to provide free representation to those who couldn't afford it. They would develop a community oversight board to work alongside the session for new recruits, a sign of the progress that had been made. Programs had already been implemented in several schools, with plans to expand citywide. But perhaps the most significant change was in the atmosphere of the city itself. There was a renewed sense of engagement, people coming together to address long-standing issues. Neighborhood watch groups were collaborating with police officers to improve safety without resorting to racial profiling. Community forums were being held regularly, providing a platform for open dialogue between citizens and local officials. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still incidents of misconduct, still moments of tension and mistrust. Change was a slow process, and there were those who resisted it at every turn. But the difference now was that systems were in place to address these issues, to hold people accountable, and to keep pushing forward. 6 months after the incident that had sparked it all, Jamal found himself back at the police station. This time, however, he wasn't there as a suspect or a victim, but as a partner. He had been invited to speak at a training. "To you about something that goes beyond policies and procedures. I'm here to talk about trust, accountability, and the responsibility you carry as future officers." Jamal had been invited to speak at a training session for new recruits, to share his perspective and help shape the next generation of officers. As he walked through the halls, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The atmosphere in the station was different. The usual bustle of activity remained, but there was also a sense of openness that hadn't been there before. Officers greeted him with nods of respect, some even stopping to shake his hand. Lieutenant Thompson met him at the door to the training room. "Thank you for coming, Mr. West," she said, extending her hand. I think your perspective will be invaluable for these recruits. Jamal shook her hand, noting the genuine warmth in her eyes. I'm glad to be here, he replied. And please, call me Jamal. As they entered the room, Jamal saw rows of young faces looking up at him. Some seemed curious, others a bit wary. He understood their hesitation. He represented a challenge to the way things had always been done. But he also saw in them the potential for real change. Good morning, he began, his voice calm and steady. My name is Jamal West, and I'm here to talk. You're here. We need officers who care, who are willing to listen, and who are committed to doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Jamal looked her in the eye, seeing the determination there. He could tell she meant what she said, and that gave him hope. To make a real difference, he continued, you have to be willing to stand up, even when it's uncomfortable. It won't always be easy, but if you remember why you started, you'll be the kind of officer this city needs. Sarah nodded, a small but resolute smile forming on her face. Thank you, Mr. West. Call me Jamal, he said, offering his hand. She shook it firmly, then turned to join her fellow recruits. As he finished gathering his notes, Lieutenant Thompson approached. You made an impact today, she said quietly. Jamal exhaled, glancing around the room. I hope so, he replied. Because this, real change, starts with them. Turn serious. This is just the beginning, she said. Now comes the hard part, implementation. We need to make sure teachers are trained properly, that students are engaged, and that the message actually sticks. Jamal nodded, his excitement tempered by the weight of responsibility. You're right. But this is a huge step forward. The fact that the school board approved it shows that people are ready for change. Maria exhaled, some of her tension easing. I just didn't think we'd get this far so soon. Jamal gestured for her to sit. That's because of you, Maria. You pushed for this, and now it's happening. She smiled, but her eyes remained determined. We have to make sure it lasts. Real change isn't just about policies. It's about shifting mindsets. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. Then we keep pushing, one step at a time. Maria nodded, and for a moment, they sat in silence. Two people committed to the same cause, knowing the road ahead would be tough, but worth every challenge. Future they had all been fighting for. Maria's expression grew more serious. It's all of our hard work, Jamal. None of this would be happening without you, without what you went through. Jamal shook his head. I may have been a catalyst, but this movement is so much bigger than me. It's about all of us working together to create the change we want to see. As they discussed the details of the curriculum rollout, Jamal felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what real change looked like, not just protests and speeches, but concrete actions that would shape the future of their community. Later that night, as Jamal finally headed home, he paused outside the office. The street was quiet, the city settling into its nighttime rhythm. He thought about how much had changed in just 6 months, and how much work still lay ahead. But as he looked up at the stars twinkling in the clear night sky, a sense of peace washed over him. They were on the right path. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But as long as they kept pushing forward, kept working together, they could build the kind of future they had all been fighting for. The community they all dreamed of was one where justice wasn't just a word, but a lived reality for everyone. With renewed determination, Jamal began his walk home, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and fresh opportunities to make a difference. He was ready to face them, one step at a time. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I pour a great deal of time and effort into crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.